Hi everybody, this is Tamara from Moogly, and I am super excited to be back with you today for another Yarnspirations Lunch and Learn. Now, we are live, so I'm going to take just a moment to hit a couple buttons here on the laptop in front of me so that I can make sure to follow along with our video today and obviously make sure I'm live and that I can answer any of your questions. So looks like we're up and running. So thank you all so much for joining me. Once again, for those just tuning in, I am Tamara Kelly from Moogly, and I am excited to be here for this Yarnspirations Lunch and Learn featuring finger crochet. This is one of my favorite techniques that I've really gotten into the past couple of years, and it's just so fun. Basically, we can crochet with no hooks needed, just our hands. Well, and of course, we need yarn. For this project, we are using Bernat Plush BIG, which is a really nice, big, thick yarn, which is really important when you're doing finger crochet. If you tried to finger crochet with your average, say Red Heart Super Saver, you might be able to pull it off, but it's going to be really difficult because all those loops are going to be so tiny and floppy. With a great big yarn like this, though, you can definitely give finger crochet, and for that matter, finger knitting, a try. But today is all about finger crochet, and in particular, we are making let me get this absolutely right here, the Bernat Finger Crochet Plush Fallen Snow Tree Skirt. Long name, they always are, right? Got to fit all that stuff in, but it will be linked in the description here and in the chat if you're watching live. So you can grab the link there or just head on over to Yarnspirations and look up Fallen Snow Tree Skirt in the search, and it should pop right up for you. So let's go ahead and switch over to the hand camera so we can go ahead and get started with our tree skirt today. Alrighty. Hi, everybody. Again, thanks for those just tuning in. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and be sure to get those links in the chat. So this is Yarnspirations Bernat Plush BIG, and you can see here with my hands in it just how big this is and how it's going to make it a lot easier to manipulate than if it was just sort of an average or medium weight yarn. So Bernat Plush BIG is what we're using today. The pattern calls for the off-white color, but of course you can use whichever color you'd like, and I'm going to use blue today because I think it's a nice sort of wintry color, and it'll show up nicely against our white table here. Now, if you haven't done finger crochet before, you are in luck. This pattern, this is page 2. It's actually where I printed out. I didn't want to use up all my printer ink, but starting on page 2 of the instructions, this is the expanded instructions meant specifically for beginners. So everything is really, really spelled out. You can see our tree skirt right there that we're going to be making. And you can see there are lots of pictures and spelled out instructions to really help you through this pattern. So if we won't get through all of it today, but do not be afraid, there is lots of information in the written pattern provided by Yarnspirations for this one. As I mentioned, it calls for Bernat Plush BIG, 5 balls of the off-white, but today we're going to go ahead and use, what's this one called? Foggy Teal. Like I say, I just thought this looked like sort of a wintry, snowy, that winter sky color, and I thought it would be really good for today's project. So we're going to go ahead and jump through. Let's take a quick look, though, before we get started at a couple of the notes. You'll notice that there are lots of links if you're looking at the pattern live online and not printed out. And then they have you to attach a new ball of yarn, work to the last 2 loops and draw new yarn through the last 2 loops, then proceed with new yarn. I'm going to be showing you there's an alternative method for that you can do to continue with that. You can do it either way, whichever best suits you. Also, when we're doing finger crochet, since we don't have a hook, everybody's gauge is going to be just a little bit different. It's going to be based on your finger size rather than what normally it would be a hook size. Everybody's hands are a slightly different size. So the main thing when you're doing finger crochet is to make sure that you can get those loops comfortably. You want to be able to fit your thumb and first finger in those loops so you can use them to grab the yarn and pull it through and just make it comfortable for yourself. Make sure not to pull back on the working yarn as you make your stitches, and that will keep your stitches from getting too tight. So the actual instructions begin on page 4. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go ahead and pull my label off. For this yarn, I do recommend that you pull your yarn from the outside. So we want to start at the outside of our skein. And this is a big, thick yarn. We're going to use it pretty quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and pull off a good couple of yards here from my skein. Alrighty. And if you've crocheted before, you may pick up on this a little quicker. If you haven't crocheted before, be sure to take your time with this. This is a lot of new skills. Even though we're just using our hands aren't used to making our stitches this way. So the first thing we need to do is, of course, make a slip knot. This is a big, thick yarn. Normally, I'd only come in 4 inches or so, but with a great big yarn like this, I like to come in closer to 10 to 12 inches or so. You don't have to break out a measuring tape or anything, just eyeball it. At that 10 to 12 inch mark, I'm going to go ahead and just lay my yarn right over itself like that into a loop so that it looks like an awareness ribbon. This is how I'm going to start making my slip knot. Then I pull this tail end behind that loop. Oop, doesn't want to stay. There we go, just like that. And then I use my fingers to grab that little section of yarn right in the center of that loop, pull up on that while I secure the end attached to the skein and the end of the yarn, and that creates the slip knot. Let's go ahead and do that one more time. You can see I just pulled on the end and it all came out. That's what makes it a slip knot. We go in about a foot or so, make our loop, pull that cut end of the yarn behind, grab that loop right in the center there and pull up on that while you secure those ends. And you can see that is how you make your slip knot. If you already know how to make a slip knot, you've got a slightly different way you do it, that's totally fine. It's just whatever works. Now this is where we need to sort of check our gauge, if you will. I want to make sure that that loop is just the right size for my forefinger and my thumb so that I can grab those loops and pull them through. If it's too tight, if it's uncomfortable, your stitches are going to be too tight. If it's big and loose, you can just pull down on that end there and tighten it up as needed. If it's a little too tight, you can pull up on the loop itself. So after we've got our slip knot made, then we're ready to start doing our chains. And we start with a chain of 9. So if you haven't crocheted before, chaining is the most basic stitch everything else is built off of. If you have crocheted before, this is just a different way to do it. One thing we want to do is make sure this is the end attached to our skein. When we go to make any stitch in hand crochet or finger crochet, we want to do it the same way we do when we're using a hook. We want to make sure to yarn over with our yarn, which means we come from behind up over our fingers before we pull it through. Now, because I've got 2 fingers here, I'm going to use that to my advantage and just grab the yarn like that because I don't have a hook on the end of my finger, but I can use it to pinch it like that. So then with that yarn pinched, I just pull it up through that loop. As I pull it up and through, I've now made 1 chain. And now I have a new active loop on my fingers, and I can pull back on that yarn a little bit if needed to get it just to the right size. So it's just good for pinching again. So we've made 1 chain. We don't count the loop on our fingers as a chain, just this one. So now we need to make 8 more. We need a chain of 9 total. So there's 1. And then we want to do the same thing again. Bring our yarn up and over our fingers, and then carefully pull it through. You'll notice as I pull those loops through, the end, or I should say the side of the loop that's attached to the skein here is in front of my fingers, facing the camera here. That's how we want to keep it. It will keep our chains from twisting. So we've got 1, 2 chains made, yarn over, and pull that loop up and through. Take a moment, get it back to the right size. Our chains kind of set up everything else. And then do it again, over and pull through. Up and over and pull through. So we can count those V's. Do you sort of see the nested V's here? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That means we've made 5 chains. We need 4 more. So that would be chain number 6. Get that back to the right size. Just take your time here, especially with these chains. Do it again. 7. Up and over from behind is 8. And finally, 9. There we are. And of course, we can always go back and double check. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 chains right here. There we go. So after we've made all our chains, then we are going to begin by working single crochets into this chain. Single crochets are the only other kind of stitch that we're going to make in this pattern. When we make a chain, whether it's with our fingers or with a hook, when we're making single crochet, we usually will skip the chain closest to our fingers right here. That acts as a turning chain. So it's like a little ladder that lifts us up for the height of our stitches as we work back into those chains and create our first row. So we chained 9, but we're going to be working into the first 8 of the chains that we made, skipping that very last one. Now, when you work into the chain for finger crochet, there we go, then you've got a couple options. This pattern says work under the top 2 loops, which would be going in right here, where you might normally go with a hook. When I work finger crochet, I typically prefer to work into the back row of humps right here. You can see that straight line. This is the underneath side of the chain. This is the top of the chain. I prefer to work into the underneath side of the chain because it's easier for me to just make sure I get under that one loop. And I also feel like it gives a nicer finished edge to our finished project. That said, you can work into whatever part of the chain you prefer. If you like to work under those top 2 loops, great, go for it. If you'd like to work under that back loop only, that's fine too. And if you'd prefer, like me, to work into that back hump, that's absolutely great. It's just when we're working into the chains that we've got a few options here. After that, we'll always be working under the top 2 loops. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and flip it over, get my loop. Always take a moment, make sure that's the right size here before we begin. I'm going to skip the chain closest to my fingers and come to the next one right here. I'm simply going to insert 1 or 2, if I can fit, of my fingers under that chain. You can see I've got my active loop there. There's the chain I've gone into. I still want to bring my yarn up and over from behind and then just pull that up through the chain. Okay? Just like when we were making chains. Now we've got 2 loops on our hands though. We've got the active loop and the loop we just pulled up through that chain. So to finish our single crochet, we're going to yarn over again from behind and pull that loop through both of those loops. And that is our first single crochet right there. So if you've crocheted before, that should look pretty familiar, just a whole lot bigger than you're probably used to. So let's keep going. I want to readjust my loop size here. Stop and look at your row. If you're getting a little confused, if it's getting twisted on you, you can always use the table or your lap in front of you and just lay out that chain and really take some time and look at it. You can see here's the one we went into last, so here's the next one. So I'm just going to go away from me, underneath that loop. Then I want to bring my yarn that's attached to the skein here up over my fingers, grab it, pull it up through that loop. Now it takes a moment and adjust that loop to be the same size. And then we can yarn over again and pull through 2. So that's our first 2, and we can just keep going on across. Find the next one, insert our fingers, yarn over, pull up our loop, get it to the same size there, yarn over, and pull through 2. Get it to the same size, find the next stitch, insert our fingers. I'm trying not to accidentally say hook. I'm so used to saying hook. Yarn over, pull the loop up and through. Get those the same size again. I always just give them a little pinch there. Feels good. Yarn over and pull through. So at first, this is probably going to feel really awkward, but as you keep going, it will get a lot easier, basically. Your hands are going to get used to making these motions. So we insert our fingers, pull up our loop, adjust to the right size, yarn over, and pull through 2. And we just keep going until we reach the end of that row. So we've got 1, 2, 3. I can see 3 little loops there that I can still work into. So we've got 3 stitches left. So we'll pull up the first one here, get that one made. Now, I have run out of the yarn I've already pulled up. Like I say, we're going to go through this really fast. So if that happens to you, pull up really big on that active loop. You can put that aside for a moment, and then you can pull up some more yarn. We want to make this loop nice and big so that we don't accidentally undo the stitches we've already made. So I'll pull up a couple more yards here of this yarn and sort of set it aside nicely. And then as I put my fingers back in, I want to make sure as I pull that loop down, as I pull on the yarn, you can see how the segment that's moving is in front of my fingers again. With these great big stitches, it's really easy to see if a stitch has gotten twisted, so it's important to try and keep our stitches as straight as we can. Now we can make those last 2 here for row 1 or our first row. Go into that next one, and if you find that some of these are a little too tight and you can't get both fingers in there, that's okay. You don't have to pull it all out. just get in there and grab it with one finger. As we make the active loops, those are the ones we really want to concentrate on getting to size. But for instance, this very first chain, it has a tendency to pull up really tightly. So if you find you can't get both fingers in there, you can stick one finger in there and kind of use it as a hook, yarn over and grab it with the tip of your finger there and pull it up and through. And then just get that loop to the correct size, and that will be absolutely fine. There we are. So now we've done one row of finger crochet, and we should have a total of 8 stitches. So when we look at those, we can look at the top of the stitches we just made and look at that. It looks just like a row of V's, just like when we made our chains. And we count each of those V's as a stitch, just like we counted each of those chains. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So those are our 8 stitches for row 1. There we go. So now I have to change the page here, and we're moving on to page 5. Well, we've already done that. That just demonstrates our single crochet. At the very bottom, though, we've got our instructions for row 2. Again, it's going to be single crochet, but for row 2, we chain 1 and then work 2 single crochets, basically in each of the stitches across, for a total of 16 single crochets. So let's do that here together. All right. Once again, I want to make sure my loops are the same size as my fingers. And now we need to chain 1. We need that little ladder, that turning chain, to bring us up to the height for row 2. So it's just like when we chained before. Even though we've been making single crochets, we can go right back to chaining. We yarn over and pull a loop through. Now we've made one chain, and that will be our ladder or turning chain for row 2. So now, of course, we need to actually turn. I am going to, because I'm right-handed, I like to always turn my project like I'm turning the page of a book. If you're left-handed, going the other direction, try and turn it like you're going back a page. The main thing is to really be consistent so that every row you turn it the same direction. For me, it's like I'm always going to that next page in the book, and that will keep your sides nice and even. If you go back and forth, it can add a twist to the sides that you might notice, especially, like I say, with these larger stitches. It's important to be as consistent as we can. So let's go ahead and begin row 2. Now I've got my turning chain there. We know we're not going to work into that. I've got my active loop on my fingers. So this right here is our first stitch. So if you're familiar with crochet, you know what we're going to do. If not, what we're going to do is we want to go under the top 2 loops of each stitch. So when we go into the first one, we'd go here. We go to the second one, we'd go here, the third one here. Always make sure to go under those 2 loops. And if you look at it from the side, you can kind of see there's a little hole right there. Another advantage to using this great big yarn, you can see right where you're going to be going. You can really hold it up against a nice light background like this if you're having trouble seeing. So let's go ahead and get to row 2 here. I'm going to readjust my loop, go right into that first stitch. Again, under both of those top 2 loops, pull up our loop just as before, yarn over, and pull through both of those loops. That's our first one, but now we want to put a second one in each of these stitches. So to do that, we just go right back in that same space. Use 1 or 2 fingers, whatever's comfortable for you, to pull up that loop, yarn over, and pull through 2. So now we've got 2 stitches worked into that one stitch, and we want to do that all the way across. Go into the next stitch. And again, if you have trouble getting both fingers in there, that's fine. Just use 1 finger so you can grab up the yarn, but then pull that loop up to size before you yarn over and pull through 2. So there's the first stitch in that one. And then we go to the next one, like so. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches made, and we've worked into 2 stitches of the previous row. And we just keep doing this all the way across. Now, if you don't enjoy finger crochet, if this hurts your hands, or it's just not the way you enjoy crocheting, then that's fine. You can absolutely use a large hook. For this yarn, I believe, let me double check before I say the wrong thing, but I believe it's a 25 millimeter crochet hook. I just want to double check. Yes, 25 millimeter crochet hook is what is recommended for this yarn. So if you have a 25 millimeter crochet hook that you would prefer to use, you can absolutely still make this pattern. Just follow the written instructions as if they were, forget that finger part, basically, and use your crochet hook. So for those who aren't into finger crochet, but still want to make the finger crochet patterns, do not fear. Just use your 25mm crochet hook, and that should get you to the project just fine. So as I said, I am just continuing to make single crochets just as we've been doing, but putting 2 into each stitch. And I'm always going under those top 2 loops. Now I need to pull up a little bit more here. Just get a little bit here. Try and get to the end of the row, into the next one. There's our first one. And then our second one. Personally, I really like finger crochet. I find that as opposed to working with a large hook, it's less wear and tear on my elbow for whatever reason. I think the hook requires more actual arm movement. This one might be a little bit more work for my hands, I suppose. But, you know, it's just a fun way to try it and really get up close and personal with our yarn here and get a good feel for it. Now here we are on our last one right here. We want to make sure, if you get lost, you can always count your stitches, but we want to make sure we're not going to work into that turning chain. We just work under that top V. So if you think, you know, you get to the end and you say, oh my gosh, is this the last one or is that the turning chain? You can always count your stitches and see. We should have 14 right now because I need 2 more in this last stitch. That lets me know that's where to stop. If you are very new to crochet and that was hard for you to see, then what I would recommend you get is what's called stitch markers. If you don't have stitch markers, then you could absolutely use a piece of scrap yarn, any other kind of yarn. It doesn't have to be this yarn, and just use that to mark your stitches. But this is what crochet stitch markers look like. They're sort of like little plastic safety pins. And with this great big yarn, of course, you can't get it around too much, but you can mark 1 stitch and then always know as you go back and forth in rows when you get to that last stitch. If you mark the first stitch of each row, then when you come back the other direction, you'll know exactly where to stop. So that is an option if that's something you have trouble with. But let's stop for a moment here because here we are. Double check, make sure we got all our stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So we know we're on track. We've got the right number of stitches. Move that out of the way. But you can see by increasing 2 stitches in each of those stitches before how we're getting that great tree skirt shape just right in our stitching itself. So really pretty, very simple technique. We're just making single crochets, but it adds a little bit of interest when you use this great big bold yarn. So that is it for row 2. So then here, if you're following along with the great Bernat Make This instruction, sort of this expanded instruction style, they show you how that looks there as well. And now we're ready for row 3. There's only 4 rows, I think. Yes, wait, let me check the last page here. Oh, there's 6 rows. 6 rows in the whole thing. They're all these single crochets. So for our 3rd row, we chain 1. Remember, that's our little turning chain, our ladder. Then we work 1 single crochet in the first stitch, 2 single crochets in the stitch after that. Then 1, then 2, then 1, then 2, all the way across. So we're just doing that increase, or where we work 2 stitches in 1 stitch in every other stitch. So where we had 16 in row 2, in row 3, we'll have 24 because we're adding 8 more, an extra stitch in only every other stitch. That's a lot of math, but you know, if you kind of think it through and as you make it, it's always good to think about things as you're working a pattern because it's going to, you know, you're going to learn a lot. It's going to give you more information and sort of inform your skills next time you make a project. And these beginner ones are so great for learning new skills with. So let's go ahead and start row 3 just a little bit. We are coming to the end of our time and there's a couple other things I wanted to go over, but let's start row 3 together. We need that chain 1 for our turning chain. So I've got my little pinch right here and then yarn over and pull through. Now we've got our chain 1, turn, just like I'm turning the page of a book, and stop and take a look for a moment. We don't want to work into our turning chain. We find our first stitch right there. You can see there's our big hole or our cave our fingers are going to go into under those 2 loops. We know that's where we're going to go. We want to put 1 single crochet in that first stitch. There we are. And then 2 in the next. Go right to the next. So 1 and then 2. Right in that same stitch. And that's our repeat all the way across. 1 in the next stitch. You can see I find it a little easier once I get going to kind of just use 1 finger as my hook, but you can do it however you like. Just make sure you get 2 fingers in there before you pull through to finish the stitch. So we've got 1, then 2, 1, then I'll need 2 in this one. And that is really how we do row 3. 1, and then 2 in the next. 1 and 2. And as I said, single crochets are what we use for this whole pattern. So since we are getting real close to the end of our time together, unfortunately, let's go ahead and stop there and take another look at this pattern. As I mentioned, there's just 2 more rows here after row, well, 3 more rows here after row 3. Row 4, we work a single crochet in the first 2 and then 2 single crochets in the one after that. So it's 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, all the way across for a total of 32 stitches. Just the exact same thing we've been doing so far. Row 5, again, same thing. This time it's 1, 1, 1, then 2. So single crochet in the first 3, then 2 in the one after that, and that's our repeat. 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, all the way to the end with 40 single crochets. Our 6th row, we just continue that pattern. Single crochet in the first 4, then 2 in the one after that. 2, so all the way across. 4, 1, 1, 1, 1, then 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, then 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, then 2, all the way across. So after that, after row 6, you can continue. There's no more written instructions, but you're just going to keep increasing evenly across the row until 12 total rows have been worked. So instructions are only written out through row 6, but we work it through row 12. Basically, that means, let's look at the pattern. Row 5 was 3 singles, and then 2, right? Row 6 was 4 singles, then 2. So row 7 would be 5, and then 2. Row 8 would be 6, and then 2, and just continue like that until you have 8 single crochets, and then an increase across each row, basically. So you'll have 12 total rows, 96 single crochets total. Like I say, that's a lot of numbers, but you see the pattern, hopefully. It just goes up by 1 in between those increases with each row. When you get to the end, you want to go ahead and cut your yarn, excuse me, and weave in your ends. You can use your fingers to literally weave in your ends of this yarn. I'll do it here with our very first end. We're just going to use our fingers to tuck it right into those loops where we might normally use a yarn needle. I personally have not been able to find a yarn needle big enough for this yarn yet, and the fingers work perfectly fine. Now, for something like a tree skirt, if you are going to put it up every year and just let it sit, then weaving in these ends and just leaving them like that, sort of trimming them off, is totally a fine option. If you have kids, pets, if that tree skirt's going to see some action and some motion, if you will, then I would recommend you take one extra step. And this is something you can also do rather than, just weaving in a new end when it's time to add a new skein of yarn. What you want to do is, let me find my collection of hooks here. You want to take a little bit of thread. Now, ideally, it would be matching thread, but you can just take some thread and a sewing needle and literally sew the 2 ends of this yarn together. You just put them together just like this, take some yarn on sewing thread and sew back and forth. It doesn't have to be a fancy stitch, doesn't have to be even a very nice stitch. It doesn't have to look great. I just blindly sew back and forth until these 2 ends are really well connected. So when it's time to add a new skein to continue your project, whether it's this tree skirt or something else, you can, rather than pulling up through a new loop and, trying to weave in all those ends, you can just sew those ends together and keep on crocheting. Or you can tuck them in and sort of leave them like you normally would. But like I said, if this is something that's going to see a lot of action when you go to weave in these ends, whatever ends you do have, I would recommend that after you've got them woven in pretty well, away from where they started, take a moment and sew this end in as well. You can just sew it right to another strand there. That's probably where I'd sew that one back and forth and then trim off that end. And that's going to hold it in a whole lot better and make it much more permanent. With a great big yarn like this, it's really the best way to ensure that your ends aren't going to pull back out of your project. So This project does use 5 balls of yarn. Obviously, I didn't get through the whole thing. We've only got a half an hour here today. But like I said, you can sew the ends together and use it all as one big strand like I just talked about. Or if I open up another skein here so that I've got a little bit of yardage, you can, when it's time to add a new skein here, let's imagine I was running out of this one already. When I go to the next stitch, I can go in there, pull up a loop, and then take my new end of my new skein and just pull that through to keep crocheting with that one. Then I would need to weave in that end. I'd probably want to make it a little bit longer. Weave in that end and the end of the first skein. Like I said, you can do it that way. That's the way it's described in the written instructions. Or if you prefer, you can just take a little bit of sewing thread and sew those ends together. Totally up to you. Both of them work. So that is that. That is the basics. Like I say, we didn't get through all the rows, but you've seen the stitches, you've seen finger crochet, and this pattern provided by Yarnspirations for the Bernat Finger Crochet Plush Fallen Snow Tree Skirt really does, as we've seen, spell out and demonstrate all of the stitches that I've shown here today. And of course, this video will stay up. So thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you'll give this yarn a try, give finger crochet a try. It's a really fun, different way to use our yarn. And we can make this really beautiful. There it is, finally found it. This really beautiful tree skirt with it. And you can see indeed how just how fast this works up. So thank you all so much for joining me today. And I hope you'll give it a try, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season. Bye-bye, everybody.